that it's either because he's being posek halacha, like the Zohar and the Kabbalah against the sources of Chazal, such as in the Sugya of Tefillin on Chol HaMoed, where it's clear that the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam all hold that you do wear Tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and the Beit Yosef says you do not wear Tefillin on Chol HaMoed. And it's clear, and he says so in his many words, that this is because of the Zohar. Number one. Number two, the other instances where the Beit Yosef does not follow his own rule of thumb is where there was an established practice in place. In other words, when the standard halachic practice of the Jews in his part of the world, that is to say in Spain or in Turkey, amongst the Sfaradim, was like a certain Shlitta, even if it's not according to the rule that he himself established, he goes with that Shlitta. And there are many such examples. In other words, from here already you see that the Shulchan Aruch was not actually being posek halacha so much as recording, as you're doing now with this camera. He was recording the reality. What is the reality on the ground? Where there was a fixed reality, a minhag in place, everyone, all the Sfaradim were following already for some time, that was the halacha from his point of view. And he wrote that down, whether it followed the rule or not. If it was just the Rosh against the Rif from the Rambam, he would still go with it. That was the reality, that was the minhag, that was the mitziut on the ground. Furthermore, when that wasn't so clear, it was a kind of issue where there's no, you can't say this is the minhag, then he would follow as a rule, that's the rule of thumb that he himself suggested. However, all of this was based on what he saw in the Sfaradi world, correct? Whereas...
Could you just clarify
please.
That last Nakuda?
Yes.
Two things. I mean, we do find in the Beit Yosef where he does not just collect various historical data, where he clearly paskins, he rejects and takes. We find that in the Beit Yosef.
We do, okay. Yes.
Now, we do find many places in the Shulchan Aruch where he does not just bring a Yesh Omrim and a Yesh Omrim, but he clearly takes the conclusions of his Beit Yosef and he paskins halakha. I mean, I think that you're in agreement with that.
What you said is not inaccurate, but it's also entirely accurate to say that the Shulchan Aruch essentially took a snapshot of the halachic practice amongst the Sfaradim in that generation, and he put that down on paper. In other words, not in absolutely every case, not 100% of the time, but 90% of the time, the Psak of the Shulchan Aruch is in keeping with what the Sfaradim were doing anyhow centuries before the Beit Yosef. And the same exact thing is true of the Ashkenazim and the Ramah. The Ashkenazim never accepted the authority of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, I believe, would have probably become a very much ignored book of halacha in the general Jewish world, the Torah world, because by this time the majority of the Jews in the world were Ashkenazim. It would never have been even have been remembered were it not for the fact that the Ramah took this book and added all his Hagahot, his annotations, to the Shulchan Aruch, thereby adapting it to the Ashkenazi reality of halachic practice. And he was doing, the Ramah Zal was doing exactly the same thing as the Beit Yosef. Just one moment.
Yeah.
He was doing exactly the same thing. He looked around at what was the halachic practice and the Masoreth of the Ashkenazim for generations upon generations before his own time, and that he wrote down as Yesh Omerim or Hachi Nohog, correct? In other words, essentially, both these Chachamim were, rather than being Mahadesh, a new system of Psak Halacha, they were recording for their generation and future generations that which was already the accepted Psak Halacha on the vast majority of issues, both in the Sephardi world and the Ashkenazi world.
With that statement, are you rejecting the following methodology in learning Shulchan Aruch? Many people learn Shulchan Aruch as not just a recording of halacha, but a carefully worded method of analysis of the words of the Rishonim. In other words, what many people do when they go through Shulchan Aruch is first they look at the Shittat HaRishonim. They see every Rishon on it, and then they reread the Shulchan Aruch, and then they see which languages, which particular nuances of words he adopted. And many people learn the Shulchan Aruch as a very carefully worded exercise, not in just merely recording the custom of yore, but a carefully worded exercise of how the Rishonim understood the Sugya and Shas, and where he chose Lashonot that specifically followed the way one Rishon or two Rishonim approached it, and sometimes even a combination of the two or three. Are you rejecting that method of... some people do. Some people say that that's overly analytic. Some people say that that's Lithuanian Jewry putting their methodology in the Shulchan Aruch. But where do you stand on that?
I'm not particularly familiar with this methodology that you describe. My methodology, my approach is to take every text, every source, as is written, of course, within the context of that sugya and that halachic discussion, and understand it as best we are able. For example, if the Shulchan Aruch writes that the halakha on a certain issue is X, and he says, I'm basing this on what the Rambam says, and you even see that in the Shulchan Aruch he words his halakha almost exactly like the Rambam worded it, which we know is very common in the Shulchan Aruch.
But sometimes he'll make a nuance of a change.
That's right. Now, let's say he deliberately made a certain change. One example that I recall is the question of whether one is required to give tzedakah to a person who is a meshumad l'te'avon. Meshumad l'te'avon, the Shulchan Aruch says you don't. But a careful examination of the Rambam, and the Bet Yosef leads us to understand that he based this conclusion of his on, he quotes several Rishonim who suggested this, and then he goes on to suggest that the Rambam also agrees with this position. However, a careful analysis of what the Rambam writes in different places on this issue indicates something else. And the Radbaz, for example, on that place in the Rambam, writes that this is not so. He says that according to the Rambam, Meshumad l'te'avon, you are required to give tzedakah to. Not a Meshumad l'hachis, but a Meshumad l'te'avon, yes, you are. So the Radbaz disagrees with the Bet Yosef on this. Now, seeing that the Bet Yosef, based on a proper iyun and examination of what the Rambam says, and based on the clear and very forceful argument of the Radbaz, in such a situation, I do not see why a person would think that you're required to follow the psak of the Bet Yosef, which is supposedly based on the Rambam, when in fact it's not. And the Radbaz tells you the Rambam says otherwise. A posek, who is a serious posek, I think, is not only able to say so, but is required to say so.
We only have about 4 minutes left on this tape. Can we get back to the rye question, and then we'll further it on the next
Yes, most certainly. What exactly is the question?
Okay. On the Rav's website, we saw that the Rav had written that rye is not one of the 5 minim.
Okay, I understand the question. Okay. Look, the Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim, Perek Sheni, here in the Talmud Bavli, appears on Daf Lamed Hey, says that there are 5 species of grain, with which one is Yoseh Hova of eating masa, and therefore also the inverse of that is that these things also become hametz. The Baraitha immediately on that Mishnah states as follows: Tana kusmin min heitim shibolet shu'al v'shipon min se'orim. According to that, there are essentially 2 kinds of grain, wheat and barley, and the different varieties, the 2 varieties of wheat and 3 varieties of barley. This is based on the explicit Baraitha in the Talmud Bavli. The Rambam writes in Ilchot Barachot Perek Shlishi, he writes this, and he says, Hamisha minim hem, he quotes the 5 species here in the Mishnah, Hitim, Se'orim, Kusmin, Shibolet, Shu'al, and Shifon, and he says, Kusmin mimina hitim, Ushibolet, Shu'al, wa Shifon, mimina Se'orim. Now we have to ask ourselves, we have to begin to ask ourselves, what is the correct identification of these different species? Let's start with oats. Rashi says that Shibolet Shu'al, he writes here in French, in ancient French, Avina, which is Avena, which is this plant over here.